Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling, well, a really pivotal moment, the early American Republic, moving from near collapse to creating a constitution.
Right. It's about how they went from chaos to some semblance of order. We're looking at the key compromises, the big fights, the ideas that somehow allowed this new nation to actually survive its infancy. Think of it as building a quick toolkit for understanding this period.
Okay, so let's set the scene. The Revolutionary War is over. Victory? But what's the reality?
The reality is pretty grim, actually. Economically, it's a disaster. You've got worthless currency floating around, huge national debt from the war.
And crucially, no power for the central government under the Articles of Confederation to actually tax anyone to pay for it.
Exactly. And internationally, nobody's respecting this new country. Spain, for instance, just shuts down the Mississippi River to American trade.
Which is a huge blow, right? Especially for farmers out west.
Absolutely crippling. And you still got the British hanging around in frontier forts, basically daring the U.S. to do something about it, even encouraging settlers to break away.
They really thought the whole experiment would just collapse and come crawling back.
They did. The sources show a real belief that America would fail within a decade. So this intense pressure, this economic mess, this international disrespect, it all screams that the existing system, the Articles, just wasn't working. Something had to change.
Okay, before we hit the big political change, let's talk about the social side. Because the revolution didn't magically make everyone equal. Especially not women.
No, definitely not. You still had the legal concept of coverture from English law. For most married women, this meant no independent legal standing, no control over property. Her husband controlled everything. That didn't just vanish after 1776.
The ideas were shifting, weren't they?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Abigail Adams here.
Absolutely. She's a key voice pushing for change. Her famous letter to John Adams in 76, she tells him, "Remember the ladies. Be more generous to them than your ancestors were."
And specifically, don't put unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Pretty direct.
Very. But John's response tells you a lot. He kind of jokes, calls her saucy, and basically says, "Don't worry, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems."
So even a plea for basic legal fairness, maybe educational opportunities, because she wasn't explicitly asking for the vote yet, right? And even that was pushing it.
It was. It shows the limits. Political power was staying firmly with men. So what emerged was this idea of Republican motherhood.
Explain that. What role did that assign to women?
It was presented as an elevated, really important civic duty, but a non-political one. Women's role was to raise the next generation, to instill American virtues, think Washington's integrity, the spirit of Lexington and Concord into their sons, primarily.
So they're crucial for the Republic's survival, but their influence is meant to be private, in the home. It gives status, but not power in the public sphere.
Exactly. It was a way to acknowledge women's importance without actually changing the power structure.
And alongside this, you see the rise of companionate marriage becoming more common.
Yes, particularly as people moved west, away from the more rigid coastal societies. The idea that marriage should be based on, affection, mutual respect, choice, rather than just family alliances or economic necessity that gained ground.
Though probably not everywhere equally.
Right. That idea took much longer to catch on in the South, where the older European model of marriage tied to property and social hierarchy remains stronger for longer.
And speaking of that North-South divide, the Mason-Dixon line takes on huge significance almost immediately after the war, doesn't it?
It really does. It becomes the line. North of it, states are gradually moving towards ending slavery. South of it, the institution is becoming even more entrenched.
This brings us to Thomas Jefferson, a figure who embodies this contradiction.
Oh, absolutely. In his notes on the state of Virginia, he calls slavery a necessary evil, which is a pretty weak justification even then.
But his proposed solution is even more revealing, isn't it?
It's chilling. He suggests that if enslaved people were emancipated, they couldn't remain in America, they should be colonized elsewhere, maybe Africa.
Why? What was his reasoning?
He believed that the hatred and prejudice built up by slavery were so deep that whites and blacks couldn't coexist peacefully. He literally predicted it would lead to extermination of one or the other race.
So instead of imagining a multi-racial democracy, his solution was removal and replacement with white European immigrants.
Precisely. It's a fundamental failure of imagination at the heart of the nation's founding. They were geniuses at political structure, but utterly failed on the moral issue of race.
Okay, so that moral crisis is simmering. Let's turn to the political crisis that forces their hand on governance. Surprisingly, the Articles of Confederation did manage one big success.
Yeah, it's almost ironic. The Northwest Ordinances of 1787, it was actually a really well thought out plan for settling the territory north of the Ohio River.
How did it work?
Very methodically, they surveyed the land into square mile blocks, 640 acres each. Then they sold it off, minimum bid of $1 an acre.
$640.
Yeah.
Minimum, that's not cheap back then, so it favored wealthier people.
It definitely did. Wealthier speculators could buy large tracts and then subdivide them for smaller farmers. But the ordinances did two other really crucial things.
Which were?
First, slavery was explicitly banned in the Northwest Territory. That's huge. Second, they set aside land in every township, specifically Section 16, to fund public schools.
So, planning for expansion, banning slavery in new territories, and funding education. That sounds pretty forward-thinking. They also wanted to make sure these new areas stayed American, right?
Yes, they required American-style governments and encouraged settlement by veterans. The goal was orderly expansion, avoiding the possibility of these territories breaking away like the colonies did from Britain.
So, the Articles could handle that. But back home, things were falling apart. What was the final straw?
Shays' Rebellion, Massachusetts, 1786-87. You had farmers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans like Captain Daniel Shays himself, drowning in debt. Their farms were being foreclosed.
Because they hadn't been paid for their war service and state taxes were high.
Exactly. So they did what Americans did back then. They protested. They shut down courthouses to stop the foreclosures.
And the national government under the Articles.
Completely powerless. Couldn't raise money, couldn't raise an army. It took wealthy merchants in Boston pooling their own money to hire a private militia to put the rebellion down.
Wow. So the government couldn't even maintain basic order or protect property within its own states.
That was the moment, especially for figures like George Washington. He saw this and realized the country was on the brink. If the government couldn't enforce its own laws, it wasn't really a government at all. It solidified the idea that the Articles had to go.
Was there any serious talk of just amending the Articles, fixing them?
There was some talk, but the momentum shifted pretty quickly. The fear of disintegration, the humiliation from Shays' Rebellion, the economic paralysis, it convinced key leaders that a fundamental rewrite was needed, which leads us straight to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia.
And the first massive fight. How should states be represented in this new, stronger government?
Right. This almost tore the convention apart. The big states, like Virginia, came in with the Virginia Plan.
Which proposed?
A two-house legislature, a bicameral system, but with representation in both houses based purely on a state's population.
Okay, so bigger states get way more power. How did the small states react?
Predictably, they hated it. They feared being completely dominated, so they countered with the New Jersey Plan.
And that was?
Keep a one-house legislature, unicameral, like under the Articles, but give every single state equal representation, regardless of size, one state, one vote.
So total opposite approaches. How did they bridge that gap?
Through the Great Compromise, sometimes called the Connecticut Compromise, it was really the breakthrough that saved the whole endeavor.
And it created the system we have now.
Exactly, a bicameral Congress. You get the House of Representatives, based on population satisfying the large states, and you get the Senate, where every state gets 2 senators, equal power satisfying the small states.
A truly political solution. But solving that immediately created another problem, didn't it? Related to population.
Yes, the incredibly ugly 3/5 compromise. If House representation is based on population, the southern states demanded that their enslaved populations be counted fully.
But the northern states objected, arguing they were treated as property, not people with rights.
Right. So the compromise was deeply cynical. Enslaved people would be counted as 3/5 of a person. Not for rights, of course, but for calculating both a state's population for representation in the House and for determining how much direct tax that state would owe.
So it gave the South more political clout in Congress, while also, theoretically, making them pay a bit more in taxes based on that count.
That was the bargain. It baked the paradox of slavery right into the structure of the new government.
Okay, structure established, compromises made. What about the underlying philosophy of this new government?
The core concept is federalism, this idea of dividing power, sharing it between a strong national government and the individual state governments.
But who has the final say if laws conflict?
That's key. The Constitution includes the Supremacy Clause. It basically says when federal law and state law clash, federal law wins. Think about modern examples like federal versus state marijuana laws. Federal law is technically supreme. This was essential to avoid the mess of the Articles where states could just ignore Congress.
But how much power did this new federal government actually have? Was it strictly limited to what was written down?
Well, the Federalists, the ones pushing for this strong national government, made sure there was some wiggle room. They included what's called the Elastic Clause.
Also known as the Necessary and Proper Clause?
Exactly. It says Congress can make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out its listed powers. The Federalists saw this as vital, allowing the government to adapt, to deal with unforeseen issues, to expand its authority if needed.
Like a constitutional blank check, almost.
That's certainly how the opponents saw it. And this is where you really see the two main political factions emerge.
The Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists.
Right. The Federalists, people like Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, they wanted a powerful, energetic national government. They favored banking, manufacturing, tariffs, a national bank sort of modeled on British stability. And they loved the Elastic Clause.
And the other side.
The Anti-Federalists, who soon become the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison initially, they were deeply suspicious of centralized power and the Elastic Clause. They wanted power kept closer to the people in state and local governments. They envisioned an agricultural republic and were more sympathetic to revolutionary France.
So how did the Federalists convince enough people to ratify this powerful new constitution, especially with the Elastic Clause worrying so many?
Partly through sheer force of argument. Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay wrote a series of brilliant essays, the Federalist Papers, published in newspapers to explain and defend the Constitution's structure and logic.
But arguments weren't enough, were they? There was another big compromise needed.
Absolutely critical. The Anti-Federalists demanded a specific list of protections for individual rights to limit the power of this new federal government. That demand led directly to the Bill of Rights.
The first 10 amendments: freedom of speech, religion, right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches, etc.
Exactly. It was the price of ratification in many states. The Anti-Federalists wouldn't sign on without that explicit guarantee that the federal government couldn't just trample over basic liberties.
Okay, so the Constitution is ratified, Bill of Rights included, Washington is president. Now comes the hard part, making it actually work, proving this government is different from the Articles.
And it gets tested almost immediately. First, domestically.
The Whiskey Rebellion.
Yep, 1794. Western Pennsylvania farmers were furious about Alexander Hamilton's new federal excise tax on whiskey. For them, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was a way to transport their grain crop more easily, almost like currency. They saw the tax as unfair, targeting them specifically.
And how did President Washington respond? Very differently than the government did during Shays' Rebellion, I assume.
Night and day difference. Washington didn't hesitate. He called up the militia and personally led an army of about 13,000 soldiers. That's more men than he commanded at any one time during the Revolution into Western Pennsylvania.
To crush the rebellion. Was it bloody?
Remarkably, no. The show of force was so overwhelming that the rebellion just melted away. Washington proved the point: without massive violence, the federal government would enforce its laws.
So the precedent was set. You don't like a law, you petition, you vote, you work through the system. You don't take up arms against the federal government.
That was precisely the message, a stark contrast to the impotence under the Articles.
Okay, so domestic test passed. What about on the international stage? That brings us to President John Adams.
Right, Adams faces a crisis with France. The French Revolution had happened, things were chaotic, and the French Navy started seizing American merchant ships trading with Britain.
So Adams sends diplomats to negotiate.
He does. But when they get to Paris, they're met by 3 shadowy French agents. Adams famously labels them X, Y, and Z in his reports back home.
And what did agents X, Y, and Z want?
They demanded a huge bribe for the French foreign minister and a large loan for France just to begin negotiations. Basically, pay us before we even talk to you.
An outrageous insult. How did Adams react?
He was furious. Instead of paying or hiding it, he went public. He told Congress and the American people exactly what happened. The XYZ affair, as it became known, caused this huge wave of anti-French anger across the U.S.
And the Federalists in Congress jumped on this?
They sure did. Riding this wave of patriotic outrage, the Federalist-dominated Congress passed the infamous Alien and Sedition Acts.
These were controversial, to say the least.
Extremely. The Alien Acts made it harder for immigrants to become citizens and allowed the president to deport non-citizens deemed dangerous. But the Sedition Act was even more direct. It made it a crime to write, print, or say anything false, scandalous, or malicious against the president or the government.
essentially outlawing criticism of the government, a direct assault on the free speech principles the revolution was supposedly fought for.
Precisely. And the Democratic Republicans saw it exactly that way. This led to a major constitutional challenge.
How did they fight back?
2 states, Virginia and Kentucky, with resolutions secretly drafted by Madison and Jefferson, respectively declared the Alien and Sedition Acts unconstitutional. And they went further. They asserted the right to nullify the federal laws.
Nullify. Meaning what?
Meaning they declared the federal laws void and unenforceable within their state borders. This threw down a huge gauntlet. It directly challenged the Supremacy Clause and the whole idea of federal authority.
So the question becomes, can a state just decide to ignore a federal law it doesn't like? That sounds like the Articles of Confederation all over again.
It absolutely raised that specter. The early republic ends its first decade facing this profound crisis over the balance of power between states and the federal government, and over the fundamental meaning of liberty versus order.
This intense division really defined the Adams presidency and led to his defeat in the election of 1800 against Jefferson.
It did. And Adams, in his final hours as president, feeling bitter about the loss and wanting to preserve Federalist influence, engaged in one last, highly partisan act.
The midnight appointments.
Exactly. He stayed up late signing commissions, appointing dozens of loyal Federalists to newly created federal judgeships, trying to pack the judiciary with his guys before Jefferson took over.
Which brings us nicely to our final thought for you, the listener, to consider. Adams's last-minute, arguably petty move to stack the courts against his opponent. It backfired, in a way, but also created something huge.
Because one of those midnight appointments, William Marbury, didn't get his official commission delivered in time. He sued the new Secretary of State, James Madison, to force him to deliver it.
And that lawsuit becomes the landmark Supreme Court case, Marbury v. Madison, in 1803.
And what does Chief Justice John Marshall establish in that ruling? The principle of judicial review, the power of the Supreme Court to declare a law passed by Congress unconstitutional.
So, the ultimate check on federal power, the very mechanism needed to eventually answer that burning question raised by Virginia and Kentucky, can states nullify federal law? That power arose directly from the most partisan maneuver of the early republic, a fascinating, almost accidental consequence of political fighting.
It truly is. Chaos breeding order, perhaps. Something to mull over.